So moving on to etiology, like we were a question about that just before in terms of what might contribute to the onset of depression or manic episodes, bipolar. So as we've touched upon in prior lectures, we'll go over some basic biological models and then some more psychosocial models and interpersonal theory as well. And so with the biological models, again, if we look at genetics in terms of depression, there is a higher frequency of depression when there's another individual in the family that has also had depression, and there is a higher frequency of mood disorders among relatives that have somebody that has bipolar than unipolar depressed proband. So that basically means that the heritability rate is higher when you have somebody with bipolar in your family than with depression, but they certainly contribute. And so 50 to 60% of those with bipolar disorder actually have a family history of the disorder. So that's very high and does suggest, again, a strong heritable link with bipolar disorder. And so this just reinforces that, looking at the classical twin studies. So monozygotic, remember this is where they have the exact same genetics in terms of sperm and egg, and 70 to 80% concordance rates there, so that's very high, contrasted to depression, about 40 to 54%. As the shared genetics reduces, this also reduces. So again, suggests strong heritable links with bipolar. So the question was about among the sets of twins, do they actually present with the precise same clusters of symptoms? I don't know that we have the research on that to know specifically what criteria of the clusters of symptoms that they each meet, because you're exactly right, they can present slightly differently, but yet across the criteria, this is the number of people that are meeting criteria to get the diagnosis. Likely within that diagnosis, there's some fluctuation, would be my guess, but we don't necessarily have the precise stats on exactly what symptoms were endorsed across these twins. Yeah. But given it's not 100%, probably the presentation would be slightly different too, even amongst the people that do share the actual diagnosis. Yeah. And so combining these then, the heritability estimate for bipolar is around about 80%, whereas with depression, it's around about 52%. And it's not just one gene, it's a combination, it's polygenic influences across these disorders as well. So it's not like you have this one gene and boom, you're going to get bipolar. So there's still quite an influence. It's nature as well as nurture, as with the other conditions that we've discussed. Other theories point to excesses of noradrenaline that causes the manic symptoms, and too little causes depression. So this has been called the catecholamine hypothesis. And there is some level of support for this biological hypothesis. So the functional levels of noradrenaline in the synapse, this is targeted by tricyclic medications, antidepressants, and that actually improves symptoms as well. And the levels of depressive symptoms, that is, and noradrenaline levels in people who have mania have been found to be higher. So again, that supports the excess of noradrenaline contributing towards a manic episode. And then if we give them a drug that reduces that excess or reduces noradrenaline, this actually reduces the manic symptoms. So there is some links there in terms of contributing factors of noradrenaline towards presenting manic symptoms and depression. And also lithium, which is a drug for mania, for manic symptoms, that also targets noradrenaline. And so given that that drug is effective for people with manic symptoms and it targets this neurotransmitter, again, that gives support for this hypothesis. Also, the indolamine hypothesis. So this is related. Serotonin is a derivative of this, and we know that serotonin is related to depression. You've probably heard of SSRIs, which are antidepressants, so selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. So that, again, that these medications work for these symptoms, that they target this neurotransmitter, implies that that neurotransmitter is important for the presentation of the symptom. So that, again, is some support for this hypothesis. The limitations of drawing conclusions around this one neurotransmitter excess or deficit is that there's complex interactions between neurotransmitters and other biological symptoms. And so that excess or deficit can actually be caused by perhaps other biological systems that produce that excess or deficit. So saying that it's precisely this neurotransmitter that causes mania or depressive symptoms is too simplistic. It does have a role to play because it's informed our medications, but it is too simplistic to really account for the heterogeneous nature of the presentation of these disorders. And so then, moving away from a purely biological perspective, there is also the life events perspective, where the idea that a significant loss might contribute to the presentation of a depressive episode. We've also talked about expressed emotion as well, and so that's, remember, if we looked at when we were talking about schizophrenia last week, that high expressed emotion in the household, such as hostility, criticism, was a risk factor for worse outcomes. And so from this life events perspective, it also has pointed to expressed emotion as a risk factor for relapse in depression. However, the limitation of this is that environmental stresses or precipitants or precursors are not always identified. Some people will have a depressive episode and it's not triggered by a life event. And so that's why people have considered that there's actual critical mediators that, it's not just what happens to us, but it's also how we respond to what happens to us that contributes to whether we have a depressive episode. And so in terms of applying the life events perspective to bipolar episodes, similar to what we see in depression, that the theory here is that life events precede bipolar episodes as well, so manic episodes. And so maybe there's disrupting events to the person's schedule, maybe there's big goal attainment events that actually contribute to the development of manic episodes. But, really what we have come to understand is, the current view at least, is that it's not just a life event. Sure, stresses and these factors or major losses put us at higher risk, but along with that is our attributional styles in the face of that stressor, and how our thinking processes interact with what happens to us in terms of life events, and how that predicts outcome. Also, how all of that is happening in a social context, whether it's family discord, less social support. So it's really a combination of a number of factors. So it's not just one neurotransmitter deficit or excess. We really can't put it down to just one major life event perspective. We can't put it down to just genetics. It's really a combination. And along with that is also a combination of our behavioural responses. And so in classic behaviour theory, really what you're looking at here is reinforcement and punishment processes. And so the theory here was that depression occurred as the result of not receiving adequate response contingent positive reinforcement. So you're working your butt off in your job and it's not even getting noticed. You're not getting a pay rise. The boss isn't even giving you an attaboy or girl. So you're not getting response contingent reinforcement there, which according to this theory, would contribute towards symptoms of depression. And so reduced response contingent reinforcement might be that the probability that your behaviour being followed by reinforcement is low, or that the probability that the individual will be reinforced when that behaviour is not emitted is high. And so all of that can contribute according to a behavioural theory. But as with all behavioural theory, it's really not sufficient because we do think, we don't just act without thought as well. And so even though that there might be insufficient reinforcement due to loss of reinforcement, or we don't have the social skills to get reinforcement, or if we do get the reinforcement, it's not even satisfactory. Really, there's more to it than just our pure behaviours. And so this is where the cognitive theories came in, is that we have an event, but it's really how we are perceiving that event that determines our behavioural reactions and also the consequences, so the emotions that we feel. And so one of the key theories here in cognitive theories is learned helplessness, and this was really promoted by Seligman. It's been around for quite some time now. And so Seligman started out by doing rat experiments where he would give electric shocks to rats that were not contingent on behaviour. So he would just shock them, and because it wasn't, they couldn't do anything about it. They didn't have control over the shocks. So eventually, even if they were put into a different cage where they could escape, they had learned that they couldn't, there was nothing they could do that they could escape the shocks. So they had learned helplessness. So then when they got put in a cage where they could escape, they didn't even bother. They just lied there and accepted the shocks. The problem with that idea is that there are individual differences within how people responded, because we are not rats, we are people. And so when this model was applied to humans, really Seligman identified that it's not just the environment that's happening there, but it's how we are attributing what is happening to us in that environment. And he suggested that this varies along several dimensions. So whether we view what is happening as personal, so it's my fault versus universal, that this is just a shared experience. Whether it's pervasive and global, so it affects everything, versus a very specific component. Whether it's permanent and stable, as it's never going to change, versus it's fluctuating. And the more personal, stable and global these attributions are, the more likely that we are to get depressed. And so if you see here in this example, I'm stupid, which is personal, as I failed the test, because I'm totally hopeless, which is pervasive. You failed a test, so you're totally hopeless at everything in life. That would be a global statement when it's just one specific thing with a test. In any sort of test, and I will never pass this course, that would be, again, that it's stable as well. And so these types of cognitions actually then feed into the emotional thoughts that we have. And so initially, this was when Seligman was zapping the rats, uncontrolled aversive events. The rat has a sense of helplessness. The rat just sits in the corner and is depressed. However, this was reformulated where we have aversive events, whether we see these as personal or global, stable. All of this feeds into whether we actually develop a sense of helplessness, and that leads to whether we feel depressed.